Ooh, oh, ooh, 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 oh.
As long as you have the church with you, and as long as you have God with you, God will make a way for you. And when they get in your way, don't even argue with them. It takes too much time. Shake the dust and step over in the door.
He is called the Lion of Zion, a reference to his many years in the pulpit of Philadelphia's Zion Baptist Church, a reference, too, to one who reigns in God's kingdom.
This OIC Center has been the place where now thousands of Liberian young men and young women have been trained doing constructive work and jobs. You hear a lot about the problems in Liberia, but you don't hear what's being done constructively out of programs like this. And I'm overjoyed. I mean, from a swamp to this, and thousands of young men and women being helped of a nation shows what faith and hope in God and hard work and self-help can do.
It is a fitting metaphor for the Reverend Leon Sullivan, whose roar echoes from the mountains of West Virginia to the villages of Africa.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you a leader among leaders, a true international leader, the Reverend Dr. Leon Howard Sullivan.
A towering figure in America's civil rights movement, Sullivan has spent his life stalking his twin foes, injustice and oppression.
Today we express our inexpressible appreciation to Secretary General Kofi Annan for permitting the announcement of the Global Sullivan Principles of Corporate Social Responsibility to be made at this special gathering at the United Nations.
But Sullivan is a man who fights without bloodshed, whose territory is not bound by church walls or the barriers that divide races or nations. He says his ministry is to lift the downtrodden, to help those who have no clothes, who have no jobs, who have little hope. He has carried that calling into the boardrooms of international corporations, and his principles of equal opportunity helped free a nation.
I want you to work together and love each other and help each other. And it'll spread all over West Virginia and one day all over the world.
The story of Leon Sullivan is a remarkable tale of faith and perseverance about a man who took a stand against injustice and oppression at an early age and has been standing on principle ever since.
Was blind, but now I see.
On March 1st, 1971, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Leon Sullivan, a minister from Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, walked into the corporate headquarters of General Motors in New York City to take a seat on the board of directors, the first African American in the history of the United States to serve on the board of any major international company. The next day, the story made headlines around the world. In spite of the positive attention Sullivan received, there were others, especially in the African American community, who believed that Sullivan was selling out to white corporate America.
Well, Leon Sullivan didn't join the corporations. He forced the corporations to join him. That was what was significant about all of that. He wasn't selling out to them. He was forcing them to pay attention to him and to others like him who were urging that they do away with the kind of exclusivity that existed in corporate boardrooms, and were urging that corporations really now put their money where their mouth was and embrace diversity.
It would not be the first, or certainly the last, time that Sullivan would be criticized for his actions. But even as significant as the event was in race relations, few would have guessed that on that day, in a plush New York boardroom, Leon Sullivan would begin to chip away at the deeply rooted barriers of governmental and corporate segregation that affected countries around the world. From his foothold in corporate America, Leon Sullivan would one day take aim at a Goliath called apartheid. But long before that day in March, and far from the gleaming skyscrapers of white corporate America, Leon Sullivan's battle against injustice began in a dirt alley called Washington Court in Charleston, West Virginia. Born in 1922, his father abandoned the family 3 years later, forcing his mother to go to work as an elevator operator and leaving Leon in the care of his grandmother, Carrie. It was at her knee that Sullivan learned a deep and abiding faith that would serve him throughout life. It was also where he learned what would become the simple, fundamental assertion that lay at the heart of his life's work, that regardless of race, every human being deserves respect, and regardless of skin color, every human being deserves the same opportunities. In spite of extreme poverty, Sullivan enjoyed the simple communal lifestyle that existed along Washington Court.
I know the Lord will make a way somehow.
Evenings brought the sweet harmonies of gospel hymns from the ragged porches of the wooden shacks that lined the alley.
He will take away your sorrow. Let him have your burden.
I guess if there was an inspirational point in my life, it was in Washington Court, hearing the old people sing those hymns on Sunday evenings, that God will make a way somehow, swing low, sweet chariot, coming forward to carry me home. Those kind of songs you sang back there. And very emotional. To this very day, I remember those Sunday evenings, and I remember those songs.
But the 1920s, especially in the South, also brought its own realities, few of them sweet. Segregation was a part of life. There were separate schools and separate neighborhoods for blacks and whites.
I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home.
And when Sullivan delivered clean laundry to his grandmother's customers, he pulled his wagon along what was known as the colored side of the street. The rest of Sullivan's life would be shaped by these early experiences of discrimination. A seminal event occurred one day when he was just a child. Sullivan entered a drugstore and sat down at the counter to buy a cold drink.
Put my nickel on the corner and sat down and said, I want a Coke. I had my nickel and I would get my Coke. And this man came, white man. I can see him today. His eyes were blazing, his face got red. And he said, stand on your feet, black boy. You can't sit down here. That was my first real confrontation with segregation from black and white. A little black boy and a big white man. You can't sit down here. So I decided, and I was only about 8 years old, that I was going to stand against that kind of thing the rest of my life.
From that moment on, Sullivan pushed against the black and white confines of his life. A gifted student with promising leadership skills, Sullivan was selected to attend the West Virginia Boys State Conference. Back then, there were separate conferences for white and black students. Sullivan experienced a moment of glory when he was elected governor of the second annual Negro Boys State. But his elation was short-lived.
I went to see the governor, the real governor, Secretary of State, and they took us to give us our little jobs. The white governor was given a job as a page in the legislature. But when it came to my job, they were building a housing project in the black section of town. And they gave me the job
helping with laborers, and my first job was digging a hole and cleaning out sewers. That was my job. A white boy was a page, and I had a job digging out sewers. That too stuck with me.
But where others might have become bitter, Sullivan used each experience of discrimination to renew his commitment to social and economic change. At Charleston's Garnett High School, Sullivan was a favorite among teachers and students, where he gained a position on the basketball team thanks to a height of 6 feet 5 inches. Success in high school athletics led to a way out of poverty when Sullivan was awarded a scholarship to the all-black West Virginia State College. When an injury sidelined him early in his athletic career, Sullivan found time for the two budding passions in his life, poetry and the ministry.
We went out of Gore Hall onto the football field, and I said, and he didn't come. I saw him out at the edge of the field, and he was writing on paper. He was always writing poetry or doing something, you know. I stopped him. I said, "Aren't you going to practice, Sullivan?" He said, "No," said, "I'm not going to practice anymore." I said, "I think I'm leaving the football field." And I said, "Well, why?" He said, "Well, I'm going into the ministry."
Others were quick to recognize and foster Sullivan's talents. His pastor, the Reverend Moses Newsom, at Charleston's First Baptist Church, was a role model and mentor. John W. Davis, then president of West Virginia State College, was another. Davis would become one of the most influential forces in Sullivan's life. The two corresponded for many years, with Sullivan frequently seeking advice from Davis. It was in college that Sullivan found his voice, found that both his written and his spoken words had a powerful effect on others. Word spread about the likable, poetry-writing young man, and Sullivan, while still a college freshman, was asked to preach at a church in the coal town of Montgomery. He was soon asked to take a second ministerial assignment, where he was paid usually not in money, but in gasoline for his car and dinners at the modest homes of church members. And when civil rights activist the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., made a 1943 visit to West Virginia, he agreed to speak at one of Sullivan's churches. When Powell met Sullivan, he was impressed enough to invite him to come to Harlem. After his graduation from college that fall, Sullivan left West Virginia on a Jim Crow train bound for New York City. At 21, Sullivan became one of Powell's assistants at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem and was awarded a scholarship to the prestigious Union Theological Seminary. During his years in New York, Sullivan found himself in the middle of the nation's fledgling civil rights movement. While working with Powell, Sullivan met A. Philip Randolph, the president of the first black-controlled union in America and the organizer of the first March on Washington. From Randolph, Sullivan learned the art of massive community organization and the meaning of nonviolent direct action. Sullivan became president of the March on Washington movement in New York City. Sullivan also caught the attention of city leaders. The mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, heard Sullivan giving an impassioned speech about economic opportunities for minorities. LaGuardia waited for him to finish and immediately offered Sullivan a position working with the mayor's office, all of which was heady stuff for a young man from an alley in West Virginia. It seemed as if there was no limit to the potential that Sullivan might realize if he stayed in New York. But Sullivan's new wife, Grace, whom he referred to as Amazing Grace, had other ideas about the life she and her husband would lead.
She decided that something was happening to me that wasn't helpful. That I was becoming too emboldened. I was a young man. I began to feel it become too pretentious. She said, I used to strut around trying to emulate Adam or something. She said, you're not yourself. She said, you're losing touch with God.
So Sullivan gave up his fast-rising career in New York to move to a small church in South Orange, New Jersey, where he attracted a large following, as well as a job offer from Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia. When he first arrived in the city in the late 1950s, Sullivan was overwhelmed by the poverty and the unemployment among its minority population.
There was a crisis that was developing at the time that Leon Sullivan went in there. He could see that the youth were losing hope, that the youth were going to schools where they were segregated, where they didn't receive the same level of education and skills building that was present in the white community.
This led Sullivan to create a vehicle for change. In one of his first efforts, Sullivan organized the ministers of 400 black churches in Philadelphia, asking their help in creating a political base. Their goal, more jobs for blacks. Sullivan decided to try a strategy called selective patronage. Don't buy where you don't work. One of the first businesses he targeted was the Tasty Cake Company. During the initial meeting with the company's president, Sullivan pointed out that there were no minorities employed at Tasty Cake. Then he asked the president of the company to reconsider, telling him that he would return in a month to see if anything had changed. A month later, there were still no minorities working for the Tasty Cake Company. The following Sunday, in more than 400 churches in Philadelphia, the word went out, don't buy Tasty Cake.
The first time I saw Leon Sullivan, he had come to Atlanta to promote the idea of this buying campaign. And I remember the first target had been Tasty Cake. And I grew up near Philadelphia, and Tasty Cake was a favorite of mine. It was a little packaged cake. It was sweet. It was good. It was great. You loved Tasty Cake. And he talked about how he and these other ministers, 400 ministers, got up in their pulpits every Sunday morning and said, don't buy Tasty Cake. And how Tasty Cake sales just dropped. And the Tasty Cake Company said, we'll hire drivers, we'll hire detail men, we'll get people who are black to go around and put our goods in the stores, we'll get people in the bakery. We will revolutionize the way we do business.
Through the Philadelphia boycotts, Sullivan discovered that most companies operate on an extremely tight profit margin, and that this margin depended on the purchasing power of black America. As Sullivan pressed forward to open up employment opportunities, he began to realize that more often than not, the minority population was unprepared for the task.
Girls who said they could type 40 words a minute, I set them to a typewriter and they would type 10 words and 3 of the words were misspelled. So I said integration without preparation is frustration. So while I must continue to desegregate and integrate America in its businesses, I got to also prepare the people for the jobs. And there were no schools in America doing this.
When many people were giving up and were hopeless and were burning, he was saying, learn, baby, learn, not burn, baby, burn. When most people were not investing inside the inner city, he was opening up OICs and saying, come, we'll teach you, we'll train you, we'll give you the skills you need to get a job. And he was going to the corporate community saying, you know, you got to be a part of the solution. And if you're not a part of the solution, you're part of the problem.
And once again, where others saw obstacles, Sullivan saw opportunities, specifically Opportunity Industrialization Centers, or OICs, a formalized program for job training that would become the largest employment training program in the world. First, Sullivan spread the word throughout Philadelphia, saying, "Integration without preparation leads to frustration," repeating his message about the importance of self-help again and again. And when the doors of the first OIC Center opened in a building that had once been a jail, thousands of people lined the streets to watch the dedication ceremony. OICs included 2 levels of training. The first level dealt with the emotional and attitudinal changes needed to empower a population that, in many cases, had given up hope. The second level of training consisted of practical work skills. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson toured the first OIC facility. Impressed by what he saw, President Johnson presented Sullivan with an award, saying, "Having been here today, I think we're going to make it." Within a few years, OIC centers were in every major city in the United States. Within a decade, they had spread throughout the world.
We call ourselves an international organization. We have 45 affiliates in 18 countries. 14 of those are in Africa. And what we do, form a partnership with them, help them in terms of getting them training, help them find funds, and help them do the manuals and the training courses, and then we sort of phase out and they do their thing. And all the programs that we have started since 1970 are still running, and most of them are running by themselves without any technical assistance from us.
By this time, Sullivan had attracted more national attention and was asked to join the board of General Motors. Many people criticized the appointment. Some felt that he was merely a token, while others said that Sullivan had sold out to corporate America. Sullivan himself wrestled with the decision.
He ran up against the supposition caused by previous black board members on other boards that if you're okay for them, you're not okay for us. But he proved to be both okay for them and okay for us. He broke the mold.
And I think he saw an opportunity working with and through GM to do something to improve the lot of black people right here at home.
It was in 1975 that he traveled to South Africa to inspect GM's operation there. Sullivan was anxious to go to South Africa, not only because he was interested in establishing OIC programs on the African continent, he also wanted to see the impact of apartheid for himself.
He saw communities that had been dramatically altered in the period since 1951. Remember that the development of apartheid takes place from 1948 through the 1950s. The nationalist government comes into power in 1948, and it comes in with an apartheid agenda. They intend to create an environment in which Afrikaners are able to move into the economy. They intend to restrict the cities for whites. They intend to push blacks away from the cities in which they were resident onto the reserves, which made up only about 13% of the land of South Africa. So he is encountering a situation in which almost 90% of the South African population is concentrated outside of the major cities, in homelands and in townships that are absolutely impoverished.
What Sullivan saw in South Africa moved him deeply and irrevocably. The complete separation of the races, as well as the complete subservience of the black population to the white, shocked him to the point that the night before he left, he invited Africans and African leaders to his hotel room where they talked all night. Word of Sullivan's efforts reached government officials, and when he left the next morning, the cab driver turned to him and asked, "You know, don't you, that you are now one of the most hated men in South Africa?" If he didn't, he soon would. When Sullivan arrived at the airport, he was taken to a small room where he was detained and strip searched.
And there I was, a member of the board of General Motors, pastor of one of the largest churches in the world, the founder of the largest training program on the globe, stand there before that man in my underwear. And I said to him, "Why do you do this to me?" And he said, "I do to you what I have to do." And I said, "And when I get out of here, I'll do to you what I have to do." And if people wonder how the Sullivan principles started, they started in that little room.
Sullivan's humiliation and the horrors of apartheid haunted him after his return to the United States.
One night, after I was on the board of General Motors, I was thinking about South Africa. And I was saying, what can be done about it? Something can be done. And again, that voice said, "Leon, you're on the board now. You do something about it. You do something about it." So I went back and decided to do something about it.
Over the years, Sullivan had learned to fight injustice by hitting it where it hurt the most, the bottom line. He now felt the choice was clear. He would engage the help of corporate America to create a battering ram that would break down the walls of apartheid. In December of 1975, top officials from 23 major American corporations formed a steering committee to refine an initial draft of what was called Guidelines for Principles of Equal Rights for U.S. Firms in South Africa. The London Times later referred to the document simply as the Sullivan Principles, and the name stuck. For 2 years, Sullivan worked with corporate officials to refine the principles while he traveled the country attempting to convince more companies to sign on.
We wanted to be with Leon. We wanted to be part of the thing. So did Frank Carey and a few others. Some of the others were not, let's say, standing on their chairs and applauding. I think they were willing to accept the ideas, but they weren't quite ready to say that this is the way that we're going to address the problems in South Africa. I think some of them didn't want to be told how to run their businesses, it amounted to, particularly probably not a black man to begin with.
On April 1st, 1977, Sullivan, flanked by the leaders of General Motors, IBM, and Mobil, officially presented the Sullivan Principles to the corporate community for their signatures.
I guess my feeling was one of satisfaction and relief that we had been able to put together what, in my judgment, was a forward step, an important one, and that we had managed to get it and do it in a way that made good sense, and that we had done it without, let's say, causing any great confrontation with anyone. In other words, there were people who were resisting, but in typical Leon Sullivan, we just kind of kept moving and moving and moving, and inevitably the waves kind of parted and it came into being.
In addition to General Motors, IBM, and Mobil, the 12 original signatory companies were Ford, Caltex, Union Carbide, Otis Elevator, Burroughs, 3M, American Cyanamid, Citibank, and International Harvester. The day after the announcement, the principles made the headlines of every major newspaper in South Africa.
They're entirely ordinary, but they are extraordinary because they were so revolutionary in context. Every employer ought to treat employees decently. We believe that universally. But that was not the case in South Africa. Every employer ought to ensure that employees live decent lives off the job. We believe that, but that was not the case in South Africa. And every employer ought to have opportunities for employees to grow and to flourish. We believe that, but that was not believed in South Africa. And what was revolutionary about Reverend Sullivan is he said, we're taking these ordinary, agreed-upon concepts and applying them to this extraordinary situation where they are not believed, and we're going to make them believe.
The war against apartheid, as would be waged by Sullivan and a few brave members of corporate America, had begun. The essence of Sullivan's most successful political strategies could be boiled down to two words: money talks. So, part of the strategy in the war against apartheid included economic boycotts against corporations that would not comply. And just as he had begun in the early days of integration, Sullivan began organizing large groups of private citizens to boycott the companies in South Africa who refused to practice the principles. It was the tasty cake story on an international scale. Within a year, hundreds of church groups, institutional investors, and individuals supported the principles by purchasing or refusing to purchase certain stocks. And by 1982, over $500 billion in stocks were behind the principles. But the critics were still in every corner. Some companies were accused of adhering to the principles solely for survival rather than for humanitarian reasons. Meanwhile, black activists criticized Sullivan for being a toothless tiger because he did not actively support black labor unions in South Africa. Throughout this period, Sullivan and his family, which now included daughters Hope and Julie and a son Howard, began receiving threats against their lives.
And there was a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 months, where we had to be driven to school, and there were bodyguards placed in the backyard, and there was a bomb threat, and I was very young. I can't remember all of the specifics, but I do remember being scared, but at the same time knowing that it was for a cause, it was for something that I couldn't articulate as a child, but knowing that it was for a larger purpose.
And in 1980, when Sullivan was invited back to South Africa to give a university lecture, the threats on his life intensified. But return he did. Sullivan met with members of the highly politicized black labor unions. This time, he threw his support behind them, agreeing that unions were essential for the empowerment of black workers. His actions were incendiary. The South African government was now in an uproar.
They would be threatened by anyone who had an agenda to change things in the interest of the non-white population, of the blacks and the Indians and the non-white population. But they understood the effectiveness of Sullivan's strategies within the United States, and they understood that he aimed to deal now with the corporate community in South Africa, that he was determined to create change and to do it based on principle. And so they knew that this would mean for them a challenge to begin to integrate their institutions, and the apartheid system opposed this in a fundamental way.
But as Sullivan stuck to his principles, the tide slowly began to turn. Black leaders, such as the Reverend Ralph Abernathy and Ben Hooks, the president of the NAACP, as well as Jesse Jackson, began to work to support the principles. Then in 1984, Sullivan decided to up the ante and added another principle that would put U.S. companies doing business in South Africa in an even more direct confrontation with the South African government. In essence, this other principle called for companies to openly break the laws that supported apartheid. It also mandated a deadline for the end of apartheid.
And then I threatened
South Africa and said, in 2 years, Mandela must be freed, apartheid must end, and blacks must vote, or else I'll bring every American company I can out of South Africa and every company in the world.
Many corporations reacted in outrage, but the American public and black South Africans gave their public support. Within a few months, Sullivan garnered support from both the Democratic and Republican sides of Congress, and an anti-apartheid bill was introduced.
Leon Sullivan came and he said, look, we've tried the Sullivan principles, we've tried this, we've tried that, and it hasn't brought about freedom. So therefore the Gray Bill is a logical extension. And it was a bill written by Steve Solars, Howard Wolpe, and myself. And it passed the House in 1985. It became the vehicle in 1986, and the Senate actually took the House bill, and that became law and overrode a presidential veto.
The next step was to bring more international companies on board. To do this, Sullivan felt that he needed a secret place where the heads of foreign companies could gather without the knowledge of the press.
During that time, I got a castle outside of London. It's called Leeds Castle. And I was able to get the castle because on the board of General Motors is a man by the name of John Horan, who was on the board, a friend of mine, who was chairman of Merck, who was able to make the inroads for me to get the castles. I said at the board meeting one time, I need a castle. Who can give me a castle? John said, I'll get you a castle. And I took that castle and I brought together the chairman of the largest corporations in the world. It was never reported because I knew if I reported it, they would never come back again. And I promised them that I would never say anything about it. Although people learned something about it, you're going to have helicopters landing and people knowing something not happening, but I wouldn't say anything about it.
In all, 3 meetings would be held at Leeds Castle. For the next 2 years, Sullivan traveled from country to country, preaching about the evil of apartheid. Finally, in May of 1986, Sullivan, running out of patience, announced to the international corporate community that the time had come for direct opposition against South Africa. On June 3, 1987, now 10 years after the introduction of the Sullivan Principles, he traveled to Washington, D.C. Sullivan called upon corporate America to deliver the final blow in the fight against apartheid.
The Reverend Leon Sullivan said it was a painful and agonizing decision.
I call on all American companies to withdraw from the Republic of South Africa until statutory apartheid has been abolished.
Sullivan also called on the U.S. government to break diplomatic relations with South Africa and impose a total trade embargo. He called for penalties against foreign companies that pick up business the Americans leave behind.
It is clear the South African government does not intend to end apartheid on its own. Since the recent elections, the government has become even more defiant to further change. Therefore, something must be done now.
Both black South Africans and Americans were critical of Sullivan, saying that if U.S. companies withdrew from Africa, they would take valuable jobs from blacks, however menial.
The people who have really cashed in are a small group of Africana entrepreneurs who have bought these companies, would amass leverage buyouts of the companies, units that have left, and have done so at bargain prices. You've got instant millionaires from divestment, but they're not the people we want to be enriched.
Sure, sanctions may hurt, but apartheid kills. There were literally millions of black South Africans and colored South Africans losing their lives, being maimed, injured, imprisoned, losing their freedoms on a daily basis. And so suddenly people say, well, now, if you put these economic sanctions on, that's going to hurt them. No, they were already being hurt. They were being killed. What the sanctions did was it devaluated the Cougaran, the currency of South Africa. It closed down all credit to South Africa and to South African governments. And without capital, it meant that the economy began to shrink. And who does that have the greatest impact on? Not the poor. Not the poor, but those who were living in those beautiful homes with the black servants who were the ruling class. They were the first to feel it. And they were the ones who began to say, hey, we've got to change.
Bowing to mounting public pressure, American companies began to leave South Africa. Within 6 months, more than 40 U.S. companies announced that they were leaving South Africa. 4 months later, 30 more companies joined the ranks. And finally, the walls of apartheid began to crumble. Within the first year, South Africa lost more than $1 billion in corporate investments. Within 2 years, the statutes of apartheid had been abandoned. 2 years later, Nelson Mandela was president of a free, democratic South Africa.
One of the tragic situations is for a freedom fighter to forget those who were with him when you were all alone. And that is the importance of an institution such as Reverend Sullivan is leading.
The mountain that had seemed immobile had moved.
With the help of God, we helped move those mountains. And today, apartheid is no more, and Nelson Mandela is freed because I believed that mountain could be moved. And where did I get the idea? From the Bible. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you can move mountains. Let me hear you say it again. If you have faith, as a grain of mustard seed, you can move mountains.
Today, Sullivan continues his fight to improve the lives of people in Africa and around the world as he takes the OIC program to the disadvantaged everywhere. Another organization founded by Sullivan is the International Foundation for Education and Self-Help, or IFESH, which, among other things, trains teachers and oversees the building of new schools in Africa. And still, there's more. In 1991, Sullivan created the first African-American Summit, the purpose of which is to forge a stronger bond between the two continents. The fifth summit was held in May 1999 in Ghana, West Africa.
The reason why we support the summit is very simple. It attracts attention to Africa. And Africa is a very important part of Chevron's world. We're the largest U.S. investor in Africa. We promote Africa because it's good for our business. The summit, I think, promotes the right type of climate for business. It promotes the right type of climate for social development, economic development.
And to see the progress that has been made here in this country is very, very gratifying. And I want to say to American friends who come along, I know you know what I speak of, and it's just good to be back here where Dr. Sullivan is leading us in building bridges between our two peoples, one people really. And as he said, this is exactly what Martin's dream was, to bring us together.
In 1992, for all that he has done in a battle against injustice, Sullivan was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, America's highest civilian award.
Leon has been a voice of reason throughout the latter half of this century. A vigorous proponent of equal rights for all, Reverend Sullivan founded OIC, Opportunities Industrialization Centers, one of the world's largest self-help and job training facilities. More recently, he has worked hard to develop closer ties between this country and Africa. Reverend, we salute your leadership in one of the great movements of our time, here and throughout the world.
One day as I was walking, when a bullet flew just over, it missed me just by inches. Well, then I knelt in prayer, praising God for his deliverance on that day. Oh, we thank you, Lord, for saving. Yes, we thank you for providing.
the Sullivan principles live on, creating a new beginning for economic justice in the 21st century. More than 20 years after their creation, the principles were reborn on an international scale. In November 1999, the United Nations endorsed the Global Sullivan Principles, which call for multinational companies to play a much larger role in the advancement of human rights and social justice.
The Global Sullivan Principles stress the social responsibilities of corporations. It was once fashionable to say that corporations are responsible only to their shareholders and that the business of business is business. Today, enlightened business leaders recognize that their reputations and even their bottom lines are intimately tied to good corporate citizenship.
Ladies and gentlemen, it can be done. Whatever problem in your mind now, go back home. Ask God to help you. He'll give you an answer. It can be done. Don't let your color stand in the way, children. People say because I'm black, I can't do this and I can't do that. Listen, black is as black does. And let us make our black stand for something. And wherever you go, whatever your color, don't use it as something to hold you back. Use it as something to move you forward. You're a proud and great and beautiful people. And God has blessed you to do great things. Help each other. It can be done.
At a time when many of the early civil rights activists are gone, Sullivan continues to work tirelessly, creating opportunities for jobs, for learning, for living freer, more fulfilling lives. He is a man of faith and perseverance. He is also a humble man.
He is well known internationally because of the principles and because of the worldwide work that he's done. But perhaps not as much as other people because he's not a public type of person. He's a private person, and he believes in God, and he believes that God is what pushes him on to help people on, in his work here on earth. And because of his religious convictions, he's not one to go out and seek attention.
If you do spectacular things behind closed doors, or in anterooms, or in boardrooms, then some people know what you do, but not very, very many. And it's been Reverend Sullivan's luck to have done what he's done behind closed doors and in boardrooms.
Leon Sullivan is a man who took commonly held beliefs about race and ability and changed the way the world does business. A man who saw the evil of apartheid for what it was and refused to be overcome by its obstacles. He is as comfortable with an unskilled worker in a sub-Saharan village as with a world leader. Because in Leon Sullivan's world, the world that began at his grandmother's knee along a dirt alley, there is no one more important than anyone else.
Shoes for the children, clothes for the children, schools for the children, teachers for the children, books, that kind of thing, that something has happened. You don't need to do great things, Charlotte. Just do specific things to help little people. That's it.
Oh, I describe him as a lion from Zion, a wonderful human being that I've known as a minister and a role model for me growing up, and a big, tall guy with a booming voice and more energy than you can imagine. And I just think he's been a wonderful person who's contributed so much to this country and to the world by linking his concerns for Africans of the diaspora with the homeland and beginning to build bridges between the corporate world and the grassroots community.
I think Leon is the last lion of the 20th century, maybe the first lion of the 21st century as well, because he lives in this interregnum period in which, now that colonialism is gone and the evil of apartheid is gone, and the Cold War is over. We truly need men and women of a vision for what the world can be like in the new millennium, in the new century. And from that standpoint, I think history is going to record that he stood astride the centuries and taught us what I said earlier was the better angels of our nature.
I was with him several years ago in Africa at the first African-American summit that he put together. And one of the things that I remember most was in his summation of remarks, he told the story of Hannibal. And he talked about Hannibal in spite of the fact that there were Alps all around him and the inability of the horses to overcome those Alps, shouting out to his troops in the midst of their own despair, "I see no Alps." In other words, we're going to move on because there's nothing out there that can cause us to stop. And I think, whenever I think about Dr. Sullivan, I remember that great booming speech about Hannibal because in many respects he was describing himself.
I wanted to come by this hospital to see these children. And I'm going to take this message back. America should help you. America should help you. Liberia is America and Africa. And if we don't help you, how do we expect anyone else to help you? And I'm going to be saying to America and to our president and to our Congress and to our nation in the United States, got to help you. We got to help these babies, got to help your equipment. I'm going to send you some equipment myself. You need medicines, I'm going to help you with medicine. And I'm going to help you with some nurses, training nurses.
We believe that you will continue in that direction. And as much as we can, it's said that we should help ourselves. And then others will see fit to also help us. All right. And so we are happy having you here.
All right. So this is your operating room. That's all we have. This is all you have.
As a boy, Leon walked to school on the colored side of the street. Many decades later, he would return to see his hometown name its central artery Leon Sullivan Way, exit 100, at the convergence of Interstates 64, 77, and 79. Asked by the mayor if he would like it to read Boulevard, Street, or Highway, the poetic Sullivan chose simply Way. Leon Sullivan Way. May our journeys carry us in that direction through a life of faith and hope and service.
This is a moment in my greatest imagination I thought could never happen. And I hope walking the Leon Sullivan Way will help every child, especially those considered the least, to know that with determination and love and faith in God, impossible things can happen.
Sing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Leon Sullivan Way. Now it's our turn.
Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. It was a band of angels coming after me. Coming for to carry me home.
A child somewhere can be helped somehow by any one of you. So help the children, and by doing in the future, we will move mountains.
Stand up, you gotta help your fellow